name is Chris Marble. I'm a associate professor at University of Florida, and I'm at the Mid-Florida Research and Education Center. And my focus of my research and extension program is weed management in basically non-turf areas of landscapes, and then also probably most of my research is in nursery production. Today we're going to talk about some non-chemical but still effective weed control tools and tactics for the home garden. So we'll just go ahead and get straight into this. There's definitely a lot of interest and increasing interest probably in non-chemical weed control methods, and that's been a focus of my research program here for, I guess, the last probably 3 or 4 years, where we've really started to look at a bunch of different things. But there's a bunch of advantages and disadvantages of non-chemical or natural weed control versus other strategies. Some of the methods that we'll talk about, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in terms of when it works, when it doesn't work, etc. But number one, this is going to be key regardless of whether you're using chemicals or not, but sanitation, exclusion, and prevention. So basically trying to keep that area start clean and stay clean throughout the process. Two, we'll talk about several different types of mulch. Personally, I think in the landscape, it's been my experience that mulch is probably the most effective method of weed control. We'll also talk a little bit about flame weeding and where that might come into play. Solarization, which is a really cool method and something that I use personally on my home garden. We'll also talk about some naturally derived herbicides. So these are still chemicals, and I am talking about non-chemical weed control. But some people still might, want to know more about some non-chemical or natural herbicides. And so we'll discuss some of those in terms of their efficacy, how they work, etc. And then also the mechanical and manual weed control methods. So we'll discuss some of those also. And I'll kind of end it with a few slides on just some different ideas and some things that I've seen either personally or things that you might see online in terms of ideas in terms of how you could set up your garden to have better results and reduce the competition from weeds. When we go into all these, I'll talk about the effective uses of all those. I'm also going to give some research summaries on some of these different aspects because I've done a lot of research on mulch, for example. So I'll talk about some of these, and a lot of the examples that I'll give are from nursery production, landscapes, other areas, agriculture. But these are all, if you control weeds in those areas, you can control weeds in the home garden. And so there's a lot of applicability there that we'll discuss about. So just because, I'm showing you a picture of a pot in a container in a nursery doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to work, for your tomato plants in the ground. It will, and it does a pretty good job. And then also we'll talk a little bit about the importance of weed identification and then knowing how a weed spreads, because I think this is probably overlooked in the information that people need to really control weeds most effectively. If you know what the weeds are that you're dealing with, and not that you just know what species it is, or what the weed is, but knowing how it's spreading. How is the primary way that this weed is spreading? Is it spreading from seed? Is it spreading from asexual means, etc.? Because if you know some of that information and a little bit about its biology, that's going to help you to pick the best control tactic for that particular weed species and give you better results. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So want to control weeds. So, and I've gotten a lot of questions about this. So we've come up with some different weed control guides and stuff like that. And oftentimes some of those plants in the weed control guides and publications are native plants, and they have a lot of benefits. And so people will say, why are you calling this a weed? But all plants, even the invasive plants, and their native natural habitat, they serve a lot of benefit. It's just when we bring them over or they escape cultivation, they begin to start causing problems when they're out of their natural range. But all these different plants and weeds, they can provide benefits. But when they get in and they're causing competition and they're spreading and they're reducing, the growth of tomatoes or squash or other ornamental plants, etc., that's when it might be time to control some of them. And like I said, a lot of these weed species that we'll talk about and that I talk about in different things, they're important for pollinators and things like that. But you might not necessarily want them to be growing in real close proximity to garden plants, for example, or in other areas. So keeping, those an area where you're maybe harboring some of those quote unquote weed species in some areas, or having pollinator gardens, things like that, or having a banker plant system to bring in some of those natural predators to help fend off some of the insects in the garden and things like that. Those are all really good tactics. So, but we do want to reduce the competition from weeds if they are causing a detriment to the plants that we're trying to grow. And so another thing that I want to point out too is when you are allowing a plant to grow there, just because it's listed in a weed book or something, it's no longer a weed because you're growing it for a specific purpose. So some examples of that will be something like vines or Spanish needles. So I was on a talk here fairly recently, and there was a lady that was on there talking about pollinators. And so she said, or she had the assumption, because I was giving a talk after her, and she said, Dr. Marble might not like the fact that I'm promoting the use of Bidens because a lot of people are, because it's a weed. But if you're growing Bidens for the fact that it's a great pollinator plant, it's no longer a weed. So it's all subjective and it's all in the eye of the beholder. So something like fog fruit, like I have here on this slide here in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, if you're growing that as a ground cover because you want to increase pollinators and you want a native ground cover, it's not a weed anymore. Weed is only a plant where you don't want it. So don't classify things as weeds. Any plant can be a weed, and depending upon the situation. So we don't want to say just certain plants are weeds in all cases because they're not. Because they can cause a lot of threats. Of course, everybody's real familiar with that. A lot of invasive plants, parasitic plants like dodder, reducing or causing competition with row crops and things like that. And so there are cases where we do have to control a lot of these weed species. So it's important to control a lot of these weeds because just some benefits of weed control in general: increasing crop yields to provide food. We've got to protect natural resources, protect wildlife and their habitats, save native species. A lot of native species are being moved out or outcompeted by invasive plants or animals. Aesthetics, in a landscape situation, that's typically what we think about. Some plants or some weeds can be toxic and they can be invasive, so we need to control those for safety purposes. Increase property values, complying with local ordinances and things like that. If someone lives in an HOA, you might be required to control some of these weeds. But we want to be able to use plants for our benefit and the benefit of others. So keeping plants where you want them is going to be the best method, and that's what we're going to talk about, some non-chemical ways to kind of keep plants in their bounds. So some non-chemical advantages and disadvantages. So pros, non-chemical control can be the most effective method. And a lot of times I'll get calls or emails and people will ask me for a weed control recommendation and all they want is a herbicide. In a lot of cases, there's not going to be a good herbicide option for the particular issue that they're facing. And so in many cases, non-chemical controls might be the only or the most effective method of control. You don't always have to have herbicides. You don't have to have as much training. There's less risk of causing any kind of environmental issues if you use these non-chemical methods incorrectly. You might smother out some plants or something like that, but especially with something like mulch or something like that, you can't cause too much damage. Maybe flame weeding would be an exception to that because you could cause a lot of damage with that if you used it incorrectly. But you don't have to do any math. You don't have to calibrate, or learn how to use any kind of special equipment. And it could be a standalone method. The cons, it can be more time consuming. And one of the first things that I'll talk about is the sanitation and prevention part of this. And a big part of that is just regularly scouting and visiting a site and keeping it clean. So it can be more time consuming. On large scales, it can be a lot more costly, especially like in cases like in commercial production. It can be more costly because you're paying a lot more for labor. In your home garden, probably not going to really cost you more money. It'll just cost more time. Um, it might not be as effective on perennials or woody invasives. So typically in your garden area, you're not going to have an issue with those. But perennial species you might, like for example, nutsedge or torpedo grass, or Bermuda grass, or something like that. Those can be more difficult to manage with non-chemical methods, but there's still some ways that you can do that and still get pretty good results. With organic herbicides or naturally derived herbicides, oftentimes you have to use higher doses, and more applications would likely be needed as well, especially for those perennial species. And then another thing is just with the organic herbicides or natural herbicides, people use household items and stuff like that to control weeds. Something like vinegar, I mean, the vinegar that you use, that's food product, is probably not going to cause too much damage to anything, but probably not as a high enough concentration of acetic acid to give you real good weed control. But we don't want to use things like bleach, high doses of salt, etc., to go out and control weeds. I always recommend, if you want to go the natural route, there's plenty of natural options that have labels that give you directions on how to use those, and then also safety precautions that you should take to be able to use those in an effective and safe manner. So sanitation, exclusion, and prevention. So just bringing in potted plants, things like that, just making sure that they're clean. A lot of these weed species are going to be spreading from seed, and so frequent hand weeding and staying on top of it is really going to provide a tremendous benefit. Here's an example of this is in a nursery container. And so you see these little seedlings coming up, and you wouldn't think that that's much of a problem. But if you look closer and you see all these little hundreds and thousands of little seeds that are all in that potting substrate. And that's because one plant was allowed to go to seed and threw off all those seeds. That's bittercress. And so weeds don't increase in a linear fashion. They increase in an exponential fashion, because one plant can produce, thousands of seed. Spurs, for example, in Florida can produce about 6,000 seed in 6 to 7 weeks in the summertime. And so they're not going in, and then all those seedlings, those thousands of seedlings, it's going to have a high germination rate. There's no dormancy requirement, and so those can start germinating and growing. And then in the span of a summer, you might have a problem that's going to be really hard to get control of. So just keeping on top of things and keeping them clean is going to be very important. And so this is part of the sanitation piece. So seaweed, the pull weed. We want to remove them prior to seed development. So when they're very small, they're also going to be easier to hand weed. But before the goal is going to be reducing that seed bank that's in the soil. And we can do that over time by frequently hand weeding, tilling, mowing, etc. Those non-chemical methods, they're going to require a consistent approach to be effective, especially when we're talking about sanitation and prevention. It's not something that you can do right before planting and then forget about it. It's something that's going to be a continual process to go out, and as you check on the plants to ensure that there's no weed seeds that are getting large enough to be able to go to seed. Using good amendments, keeping areas mowed, around the garden and things like that. Those are all important. Grass clippings and stuff like that can be a really good mulch material and increase organic matter and things. But if you're using like, for example, mower clippings and you have a weedy lawn, that can increase weed pressure. You also want to be careful about that too. If, for example, you had a company that came out and treated the lawn with a herbicide, you wouldn't necessarily want to use those clippings in your garden with food plants or anything like that. So that's something to keep in mind too. Those are good for soil and things like that, but if you do have a lot of weeds, it can increase weed pressure in some cases. But keeping those areas mowed, using weed-free amendments, things like that, are all very good choices. So this is just a study just to show you kind of the power of this. So this is at a commercial nursery over in the Tampa area. And this is a trial that we did a couple of years ago. And basically all we did is we changed the hand weeding frequency. So in nursery production, weeds are a huge issue because they're using overhead irrigation, typically high fertilization rates to try to get those plants grown and sold. So there's always a lot of weed pressure. And so we had 2 blocks of plants, this block here and this block here of these junipers. And so basically all we did is both blocks of plants were treated with herbicide, but all we did is for this section of plants here, right here, we went through and we scouted every 2 weeks and we hand weeded. And all we did is we would go quickly through that block and we would pull any weeds that had emerged. Here, all we did is every 8 weeks before we went out and reapplied the herbicide, we went in and cleaned the plots up before we put out another pre-emergence herbicide application. People are going to say, of course, the 2-week interval, you're spending a lot more time, you're weeding a lot more. Of course, it's going to be clean and, substantially cleaner than the 16-week interval. But this is where kind of the magic happens here. So here's the weed biomass, and this is cumulatively over a 24-week period, so 6 months. So 2-week, we have very, very little biomass. When we were weeding every 8 weeks, we had, substantially higher biomass here. And that's just the weed weight. When we went in and pulled the weeds, we would weigh them afterwards. And then this is the cost per acre. So it was a 66% reduction in labor by weeding every 2 weeks, as opposed to just weeding once that weed problem got bad. So why was that happening? Why did we weed basically 4 times as frequently, but we spent less time overall? And that was because we prevented those weeds from going to seed, because we went in there very regularly. It was minimal. We would basically, I remember we would drive, or I would drive, over an hour to get there every 2 weeks to do our ratings and collect our data. And then I would be out of the truck and back in the truck within 15 or 20 minutes. And we were weeding, probably 600 or 700 pots doing that. But it was very fast for those 2-week interval pots, because no weeds were able to germinate because we're just weeding them so frequently. No weed species is going to be able to germinate and produce seeds inside of 2 weeks. So really good way to save time overall and just keep that area as clean and sanitized as possible. So this method is going to be the most effective on weed spreading from seed. So if you were dealing with like some of these perennials, like maybe torpedo grass or Bermuda grass or something like that, this isn't going to be that great of a method, because those species are kind of hard to hand weed. The same thing for something like nutsedge. But for those species, which are going to be the most common ones that you'll be dealing with, of those species spreading from seed, this is a very effective method. All those annual species like spurge, bittercress, oxalis, crabgrass, etc. This is going to be a great tool, but it's going to help stop them before they become unmanageable. Because, like I said before, if we're not using chemicals, we don't have that quote unquote rescue option. And so we just need to keep it clean throughout the process, or at least until we finish the spring crop or fall crop or whatever you're growing in the garden at the time. So mulching, organic and loose field mulch. So this is, like I said, this has probably been the major focus of my research program, at least on the landscape side over the last 4 or 5 years, is looking at a bunch of different mulches, different depths, etc., how long they last. We've done a lot of this work. It's the cornerstone of a great weed control program. What you want to use if you're looking for a mulch for weed control purposes is you want to use a coarse textured mulch. And I'm not talking about, like, you wouldn't have to use like something as big as those big pine bark pieces that are huge, but something like a pine bark mini nugget, pine straw, something like that. those would be great. And you want them to apply them at about 2 inches or so, or greater thick. So 2 to 3 inches, something like that. That's around what you want. You want to have that soil surface completely covered. It's going to give you really good control of annual weeds, and it's going to control annual weeds better than perennials. Because sometimes when I was giving a talk and I said, the joke that I always say is I ask everyone, who knows what's the best type of mulch to stop nut sedge? And no one ever knows. And that's a question that I often get, is what kind of mulch I can use and how deep does it need to be to stop nut sedge? And I always say I mean, if you go as high as 6 inches with asphalt, you can slow it down for a few months. So that was a joke. But another thing to consider too, you want those coarse texture mulches because they're going to dry out quickly, and they're not going to hold a lot of moisture. You don't want your mulch to hold a lot of moisture in the mulch layer itself. You want to hold that moisture on the soil. The fine texture organic mulches, so I mean, anything that you apply to the soil surface can be considered a mulch. Things like really fine pine bark, like you would see in like potting media, peat moss, different leaf clippings and stuff like that. In some cases, in grass clippings, like if it was a weedy grass, in some cases those can promote weed growth because it gives them a lot of organic matter and nutrition, but it's going to improve the soil profile too. So it's not something that you should necessarily avoid. But if you're going to use those really fine texture organic materials to amend the soil or as kind of a top dress, the main benefit of those isn't going to be weed control, but it's going to be for soil improvement and things like that. So you might use those in combination with some other method that we'll talk about. Here's some example of organic landscape mulch types, the same types of mulch that you use in planting beds. You know, you could use it around the garden, and you might not, mulch the whole garden, but you might mulch around individual plants and just give you enough space to go in and possibly hoe or till or something like that. But how do these different mulch materials differ between pine bark, melaleuca mulch, pine straw, wood chips, etc.? How do they all differ? And it kind of depends upon the way that mulch is going to control weeds. So the three big ways that mulches control weeds is, one, it provides a physical barrier, and that's going to be for the seeds that are below the mulch. So the seeds that are already in the soil, the mulch is on top, and once the seed germinates, and sometimes that seed doesn't have enough nutrient or carbohydrate reserves to push itself all the way up through that mulch layer before it gets sunlight and can continue to grow. So it provides a physical barrier. It also reduces light. A lot of weed species require sunlight in order to germinate. So if you have a good 2-inch or 3-inch layer of mulch down and you're blocking out all the light, those seeds don't get the light that they need, and they won't germinate. Also reducing available water. So this is key too for weed seeds that are introduced in on top of the mulch. When you have those fine texture mulches or mulches that hold a lot of moisture, they're still going to do a great job on the seeds that are below that mulch layer in the soil already. But eventually over time, you're going to have seeds that are introduced on top. Just naturally, that's going to happen, really regardless of how clean you keep the area. But if you have those coarse texture mulches that don't hold a lot of moisture in the mulch layer, when those seeds are introduced on top, they're not going to have enough moisture to germinate, and they'll just kind of sit on that mulch layer, and they won't germinate. Allelopathy is another thing. So that's basically the mulches that will have some sort of chemical that can hinder the growth of other plants. That's going to work mostly on the seeds that are below, and it's going to work on both seeds that are below and above the mulch layer. But for the mulch materials that you're going to buy commercially, we've done some testing, and we haven't really found any high concentration of any allelopathic chemicals in any of these mulches, because most of the time when you get them, they're going to have been aged for a pretty good bit of time. They're not going to be fresh or green. So a lot of that is gone, and a lot of those plant species that they use for mulch materials anyways don't really have a lot of allelopathic chemicals in them to begin with. So particle size, so this kind of gives you an example of when I'm talking about coarse texture mulches. And with coarse texture mulches, you want most of the particles to be, in somewhere between the 1/2 inch or above range. So 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch, etc. And that just means, like if you were to put them through a screen, that's going to be most of the sizes there. So we look at all these different mulch materials. So this was a eucalyptus mulch. And a lot of this is a shredded wood, and a lot of the shredded woods that we have are pretty similar to this. Melaleuca was similar. There's several other different shredded wood materials that are similar where, there's a major portion of that, those particle sizes that are below that 1/4 inch size frame. So they're a lot smaller particles. You can kind of see it here where when that wood is shredded, you have a lot of small particles. Again, still good for those seeds that are below, but not necessarily for the seeds that are above that mulch layer. Whereas if you look at pine bark mini nuggets, you have a lot of those materials that are a lot of the particles that are fairly large in size. You can kind of see that here. There's not very many fines there because those have been removed and used for other purposes. And then, of course, pine straw is going to be mostly, that larger material. It's not going to go through a screen, and those needles kind of fit together nicely and form a nice layer. This is where it kind of becomes important. And I think this was maybe with Melaleuca was what we called the hardwood here, or basically just not pine bark. But this is the percent moisture retention over time. So this is after 24 hours. After basically what we did here was we had these different mulch materials in pots, and then we applied equivalent to 1 inch of rainfall to the top of those, and then we looked at drainage over time. And so you can see with pine bark and pine straw, which are represented by this green bar and this red bar, they're holding about half the level of the moisture that shredded wood material is holding. And so those materials that have very fine particles, they'll typically hold more moisture. And so what can eventually happen is as seeds are introduced on top, we've seen a lot of weed seeds that can start to germinate and grow on top of that mulch layer. If it's deep enough, they're still not going to grow and probably mature because there's inherently very little nutrients there. But if in those areas that it's thin and things like that, those weeds can eventually tack down into the soil and continue to grow. Still good mulch materials, but for those weed seeds that are introduced on top, they don't perform the best. Here's the annual cost of weed control methods. So this was a landscape bed, but this is one thing I wanted to point out in terms of how effective these different mulches are. So here's a pine straw and a pine bark. This is after a year of doing this study. So the red bar is basically a hand weeding cost to keep weed level below 20%. This is a mulch replacement cost, which is this yellow bar here, and that's to keep the mulch at least 2 inches of depth because it will break down over time. And then the blue bar here is a herbicide cost because we did add 3 applications of a pre-emergence herbicide to compare those. And so one thing that's interesting to see is the straw and the bark by themselves compared to the herbicide alone. A herbicide alone by itself, without any mulch or anything there, just applied to bare soil, it's not going to be that effective. At least for most herbicides that are going to be labeled for use in landscape areas and things like that. So even with frequent applications and going in and hand weeding some of that, the mulch materials really outperformed it throughout the course of the experiment. And there wasn't that great of a benefit. If you keep that mulch layer at 2 inches or so, there wasn't that much of a reduction in cost by adding the herbicide to that mulch. So it's important to use mulch and then keep it at that adequate depth throughout the time that you're growing. Here's some other trials that we did with some different mulch materials. So this is where we use some tackifiers, which are basically like this was a guar gum, a natural tackifier that kind of held those mulch particles together. We were looking at this at several different plant nurseries to see if we could prevent blowout for when nurseries have high wind events and stuff, and some of the mulch material will blow out of the containers. But we were looking at things like sawdust, pine bark. This is a hardwood mulch, shredded mulch material. This was a paper slurry that we made where basically it's like a paper mulch. And it worked pretty good initially, but eventually it shrank down over time. But it was kind of a cool thing to look at. And then this is a plastic mulch. So this would be like going with plastic over the soil surface, kind of like you see commercial like tomato production or something. And we had drip emitters underneath all those. You can see them sticking out of pots here. But that's how that pot was actually irrigated with the plastic over the top of it. And then we had a herbicide that was a control. So just herbicide and no mulch. And then we had just a non-treated control. And so this was the percent control that we got. And then this is based upon hand weeding time. But again, you can see that the one application of mulch is going to outperform one application of herbicide all the time. Pine bark and hardwood, those perform very good. So those mulch materials. The plastic was the best, but again, that could be hard to implement. In a home garden situation, you'd have to have some type of drip irrigation. And then also the plastic, people will, they can be hard to recycle and things like that. And it's can create some problems. It can tear and rip and make a mess, with the plastic. But if someone was to grow under a little bit heavier plastic than we used, it could potentially, especially on a small scale, be reused multiple times. Here's some advantages and disadvantages of these different mulch types. So with pine bark, very durable, very good weed control. If you went up to the larger particle sizes, like if you didn't get the mini nuggets and you just got like pine bark nuggets, the larger that particle size is, typically the higher depth that you have to go to cover up that soil surface completely. So if you have really big, pine bark particles like you might see in some landscape situations, it could require more mulch to actually get to where you're covering that whole soil surface. Another thing too with pine bark that can be a disadvantage in a garden situation with those larger particles is if you did need to go in and till it up prior to planting, maybe you had a spring planting and then you went fallow over the summer and you were going to do something else in the fall. If you had those large particles, they can be hard to kind of work with and till under and things like that. So going a little bit smaller using mini nuggets and things like that can be good in a garden situation. The pine straw, you often get more coverage for the cost, very easy to apply. The disadvantage would be that it degrades pretty quickly. But if you're talking about a 3 or 4 month crop, pine bark or pine straw is going to do really good for you. And because it does break down very quickly, it is something that, you wouldn't have to worry about having to work around the next time you went in and planted there. There's a bunch of different hardwood or softwood wood materials that are used as mulch. It really just depends upon how it's processed. So the chip particles that are chipped and a little bit larger, those tend to provide better weed control than the shredded materials. And then wood is always going to degrade faster than a bark. So those wood materials, they do degrade faster than the pine bark does, but they're still pretty good for weed control. You probably wouldn't want to use rock, in a garden type situation. Melaleuca, so that's another type of mulch. Advantage of it will be that it takes out Melaleuca trees, which are invasive. And sometimes it can be cheaper, but we did look at a lot of Melaleuca mulch, and it did hold a lot of moisture within that mulch layer. And we saw some weed species that were able to germinate on top of that. I don't think that's really enough to say that you shouldn't use it. I use it a lot and have real good success with it. Probably just not as effective, on certain weed species than something like a pine bark. And then grass clippings, leaves, etc. Cheap, typically readily available. Use different clippings and things like that from your home. But they're not as great for weed control, but they're good for the soil. And then again, I'll say this, just be mindful of any chemicals that have been applied on the lawn. They took a lot of that stuff off the market, things like clopyralid, that people were, damaging vegetable plants and stuff like that, because they were using the grass clippings and compost, where it can only be used in commercial settings now. But still, you would just want to be mindful of those things. And if your lawn's being regularly treated, probably not a great idea to use the grass clippings in a vegetable garden or anything like that. So living mulch, we'll move on to that. So this is another type of mulch. Basically, planting or leaving a fallow space and then planting some type of soil cover around those bare areas and things to keep out the weeds. So there's a lot of different ones. There's a IFAS publication that lists a lot of these things like clover, winter rye, hairy vetch, cowpeas. Perennial peanut is, that's a common ground cover. People will use that in pastures and things like that. And it could be, like a border of a garden and things like that. I've seen it used pretty nicely, and it provides a little bit of an aesthetic benefit, but more permanent than some of these others. But it can keep the weeds down in gardens and increase fertility and organic matter. And a lot of times people will use these living mulches like in the fallow time. So when they're not planting or growing anything in their garden, they might overseed it with some of these living mulch materials, let those stay and kind of grow and provide benefits to the soil while they're not using that patch of soil. And then when it gets time to plant again, when they're going in and preparing, they can till that all in. You increase your organic matter, your water holding capacity of your soil, and it provides a lot of benefits there. There's advantages and disadvantages to using this. So the legumes, the things like the cowpeas and stuff like that, they can definitely improve soil fertility. They're natural. They can prevent erosion, and so increase the soil health. I talked about them being able to be tilled in to increase organic matter. But some of these can be weedy or competitive, if you were trying to grow these alongside the crop at the same time. But again, it could be great to use during those times where you have empty areas where you're not gardening in that area, or when your garden is going to stay bare. So I have a big bare patch at my house. And when I'm not growing anything in there in the winter, I'll do annual ryegrass, and that's mostly just to provide something there on the surface of the soil, so that when the dog or my son go out there and play, they're not just playing in the dirt there, and it just provides a nice cover. Don't mow it at all. I just let it grow until it's time to plant in there again, and then go and till all that in. Flame weeding. So this is one that I've gotten some questions on, and I've seen people use this pretty effectively. There's a bunch of small little torches, butane, propane torches that can be used for weed control, and they're pretty cool. It's kind of like a little flamethrower. So I say it's the most rewarding and satisfying method of weed management. And people will typically use these in driveways or hardscapes and stuff like that. But they could be used, in non-crop areas or blank spaces in the garden. You wouldn't want to use them in close proximity to any kind of plants that you're growing. And you don't have to have the plants, you're not burning them. You're just holding them on there enough to burst those cells and to cause the weed to desiccate. It's going to be most effective on annual weeds and typically broadleafs. You're going to control those a lot better than you would grasses or sedges. And like I said, again, it wouldn't be suitable for use in close proximity to garden plants, but it is a great non-chemical tool that you could use depending upon your setup. So I've seen this used where they'll put basically flame weeders on the backs of tractors and things like that, and go down row middles as they're planting or tilling up, where they're planting tomatoes and things like that. So it can be used, in and around those plants, but not actually, in close proximity to the whatever plant it is that you're trying to grow. And then solarization. So this is a really cool method, one that I've used a lot personally with a lot of success. But basically, we're heating up that soil and cooking it, and cooking out all the weeds and maybe even some pathogens and things like that also. So this picture here, this is from Sean Steed. He's a extension agent over in Hillsborough County, and he did a trial at a nursery where he was looking at solarizing their soil. A lot of nurseries will, quote unquote, recycle their potting soils. So soils that maybe are in plants that they had to throw away or that fall out of the hopper and things like that, and they're keeping it all into a pile, and then they're reusing it. And the big problem with that is typically as that soil sits around for a while before it's reused again, it gets a lot of weed seed contamination. And so he was looking for ways to kind of clean that up and to kill off some of those weed seeds. And so this was the setup that he had here, where he had some clear plastic, and he had the soil underneath these bars here, and he heated it up, and I'll show you some of the results that he had here in a few slides. But basically, what you're doing with solarization is you're heating the soil by covering it with clear plastic. Typically, it's going to take about 6 weeks or so. And what it'll do is it'll kill pests within, really, you're looking at the top 6 to 12 inches. In some cases, they've seen, effects down as low as 18 inches, but most of the time not that deep. But you're killing weeds, pathogens, insects, larvae, etc. Oftentimes, things like nematodes are too far down in the soil to really be affected by solarization, but especially the stuff that's in that top 6 inches or so, which are a lot of weed seeds, you can get pretty good control there. So you want the soil to be at least a little moist. You don't want to do it on, completely dry soil. You want a little bit of moist, wet soil conditions. And so you could, if it was a real dry time, you could possibly irrigate, lightly before you went in and put your plastic down. And you want to do it in the warm time of the year. That's going to be the most ideal. So maybe you don't grow anything in the hottest part of the summer, that July, August, September time frame. Or maybe you're wanting to grow something during the summer, and so you do it in the time in the spring where we're not getting a lot of rainfall, but it's still very warm. So something like that will work great. You just want to get that soil temperature up high enough, which is typically around 130, 140 degrees, to really have a lot of benefit. So you want to use clear plastic. The thickness isn't that important, but if you go a lot thinner than 1.5 millimeters, you can have tears and rips, and it's a lot easier for that plastic to tear and things. You could go thinner, because even a thin layer of plastic will still trap a lot of heat, but you run into durability issues and things like that, or the plastic drying out and cracking and things like that. But the clear plastic, you want that because it's going to allow the light to come through it, and it'll trap that heat. You want to do it in an area where you're getting full sun, and then typically, most gardens, especially vegetable or fruit gardens or anything like that, you're going to have, those are going to be in areas of your landscape where you have a lot of light anyways. So basically what you want to do, clear the site. Any amendments that you want to add in terms of compost or stuff like that, you could till those in to the top portion. You could also till down to 6 or 8 inches or something like that. And that could also possibly increase the effectiveness of the solarization by loosening up that top portion of the soil. Another thing is that you want to have a crown, and that's if all possible. So you don't want the water to collect on top of the plastic. So oftentimes you'll see the beds that are kind of shaped like this, where they have a little bit of crown, where it's a little bit higher in the center than it is on the edges. And so then, so that rainwater, especially if you're doing this during the summer, that rainwater is not collecting on the top, which is going to cool off that soil that's sitting there. You can bury the edges, just kind of bury those with the soil that's around there. But you want to have enough plastic to where you're covering up the portion that you need for the garden, but then have, maybe a foot or so on all the sides so that you can bury it, or secure it with bricks, things like that, so that it's not going to blow away. And then after you solarize and you have it in there for maybe 6 weeks or so, and you reach that temperature, it's going to give you about 3 or 4 months of good, clean soil where you see a benefit. Eventually, over time, weeds will come back and start to grow. You might see this. This is a nut sedge that was able to germinate, but then it starts to die and smother out after it germinates. So you'll see that underneath the plastic there. If you have a lot of weed growth, and you might have, if you had a bad nut sedge issue, the nut sedge can poke up and grow through the plastic. But if you had a lot of weed growth that was coming on and you didn't see them starting to brown out and die, it might not be getting hot enough. You might not have it sealed off good enough, etc. So you would have to pull the plastic off and start over. This is going to be most effective on annual weeds. Perennials, some of them might have deep tubers or roots or etc. that aren't as affected, depending upon how warm you can get that. Disease pathogens, it can reduce the pressure of a lot of those, but not all of them. And then nematodes, like I said, a lot of nematodes can move deeper into that soil profile, so they might not be, it might not be the most effective method for those. Here's some results from Sean Steed where he did the solarized. This is potting media, so this isn't technically soil. This is pine bark and peat moss, but 80 to 90% reduction in weed germination by solarizing that soil. So quite a bit of improvement there. And he only had it solarized for 14 days in this case, because it was on a concrete mat, so it's a little bit different in this case. But 140 degrees, he got it up there, and 89% reduction in weed seed germination. Here's a great article for anyone that's interested in employing this. This is a University of Florida EDIS publication, Introduction to Soil Solarization. And if you're not familiar with EDIS publications, I'd encourage you to Google those. Just Google UF-IFAS EDIS publications, and you can go and search by topic and find a lot of great information there. But this is a really great article on soil solarization. It shows you the step-by-step guide on how to do that, what to look for, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're wanting to solarize, I'd recommend taking 5-10 minutes out of your time to read through this to make sure that you're doing or getting the best results possible. So now we will move on to some naturally derived herbicides. People have had a more interest in these with a big move towards organic or natural here in recent years. So here's a bunch of different active ingredients. Here's the trade names. So you have things like acetic acid, fatty acid soaps, ammonium nanoate, different clovols and things like that. And I'd say when you're using charts like this, don't pay as much attention to this trade name here, because none of these materials here are patented. And so, you know, you can have these active ingredients in a bunch of different names, but you want to look for the active ingredient that you're looking for, not as much for the trade name. And I try to tell people that to do that just in general, because I'll get questions where someone will say, I use Weed Be Gone, you know, Weed Be Gone for zoysia or something. I don't know what active ingredient is that they applied, and they don't know. And so I say, know your active ingredients so that you can pick the best herbicide, because those trade names or brand names change all the time and they're used interchangeably. And you can't really go off of that because you can have the same brand name or trade name and it might have, you know, 6 different active ingredients depending upon what the use is for it. So, but there's a lot of different natural derived products, citrus oils, clovols. I don't have it on here, but oregano oil is another one. They're all good. They're all going to perform pretty much similarly if you follow the label directions. So these are going to be contact herbicides, so they're not going to translocate down and affect the roots, but you can burn the tops off of the weeds. And for annuals, that'll often give you, you know, 100% control. It won't come back. They're going to typically require really good coverage, so making sure that you have good coverage of those weeds when you're spraying, and then also they're going to they can work very quickly too. Sometimes in as little as 30 minutes you start to see symptoms. So here for this list here, I have several different lists of these different naturally derived herbicides, or etc. On this one, all I did was I selected the ones that are OMRI certified. So that's the Organic Materials Review Institute. And so when a grower wants to become, you know, certified USDA organic, they can use OMRI listed pesticides on their crops and still keep their organic certification. So these are all considered organic approved herbicides. With these naturally derived herbicides, look for the actives, know the actives. I've already talked about that a little bit. A lot of these are derived from natural plant oils or natural processes. But just because it's derived from a natural plant oil, it doesn't mean that it's not a chemical. So like I said, these don't really belong that much in a non-chemical weed control talk, because they're still chemicals. They're still pesticides. You know, you go to an organic farm, they're using a lot of pesticides. They're just using different kinds of pesticides. But you still want to respect these and use these like you would any other pesticide, because some of them can be pretty acutely toxic, meaning that they could cause immediate burns and things like that. But just read those labels, follow them, use the proper safety precautions, use gloves, eye goggles, aprons, whatever it says on there. Just because it's organic doesn't mean that it can't potentially cause harm if it's used off label or incorrectly. Just be mindful that a lot of these, they're not going to have a long residual or any residual really. So they're just going to control the weeds that are there. They're not going to give you any kind of pre-emergence effect. So you would have to use those fairly frequently, but they could be part of an overall, natural or non-chemical, maybe more natural weed control program, integrated weed management program. If there were, a larger area and you could use herbicides that would really save you a lot of energy, but you didn't want to use synthetic herbicides, these might be an option where you could go and choose some of these. Like I talked about, their contact, so there's not going to be any translocation. So larger weeds, you're not going to get the best results. You will get very fast results. You'll be able to tell that you treated something pretty quickly. They're going to be most effective on small annual weeds, especially broadleaf species. Grasses and sedges can often recover faster than broadleaf weeds can. And there's not going to be really any selective options. So it's going to be something that is going to affect, all the plants that it's sprayed on. You're not going to be able to go over the top of, a desirable plant or anything like that. But, and they can also be pretty expensive. And you see a jug and, you might get 2.5 gallons of something, but it's ready to use. And it might be, you don't get that far with it because you do have to have good coverage and things like that. So they can be costly, but they can be, pretty effective and save you some time and energy over time by incorporating these into a weed control program. So when would herbicides be needed? If you've got a small garden, you're on a 1/3 acre lot and you've got, a garden that's, a couple hundred square feet, something like that, you're probably never going to need herbicide. You can probably do it with the sanitation and using mulch and things like that, and for pretty inexpensive. But you could use these, in larger areas or just as part of your program to save some time. But use them with non-chemical methods too, because they're not going to be, there's no silver bullets here. And so we don't want to just rely on one method to control the weeds. We want to use a combination of things. Like, for example, you could start out with solarization, start out really clean. And then if you had a few weeds popping up here or there, you might could hit them with one of these organic herbicides, for example, in some areas. And herbicides might be the best option, in some cases where you're not going to be able to remove something manually or with some of these other methods. So some of these really invasive plants and things like that, or plants that might be harmful, weeds that might be harmful, that then it might be a case when herbicides might be the better option. Mechanical and manual controls, so things like hand pulling, hoeing, tilling, mowing, raking, cutting, etc. So these are all really effective. And the thing that I always say is there's never been a weed that's developed resistance to hand pulling if you pull the whole thing up. So that's going to work on just about everything. It's just some weeds are going to be a lot more difficult to hand pull than others. But for most of them, you can do a pretty good job with these mechanical and manual control methods. There's also a lot of different tools and things like that that you can use to help control weeds. Some of those are effective. You just got to be able to use them correctly. I've always been able to get stuff out with my hands and maybe a little bit of maybe a little spade better than I could any of these other tools and things like that. But can tilling or hoeing make weeds worse? So that's a question that I've gotten before. And if you're getting a lot of rainfall and things like that, so like maybe during the summertime, it could in some cases. So for some species that spread vegetatively, even a small, tiny rhizome fragment can grow into another plant. And so some ones that we think this could be, a concern will be things like nut sedge or dollarweed, Florida betony, torpedo grass, etc., where if you went in and you just had a small patch and then you tilled all that area up, and then you got some good rainfall, the following days, those weeds could come back up from the tips. So maybe instead of just tilling it and leaving it or planting right into it, you till it and then you do a solarization, or you till it and then or you don't till it and you just work on using some of these other methods to kind of smother them out, or reduce competition, or go through and manually remove those. So just be mindful of those weeds that are there and how they're actually spreading and growing. So we'll go into some of the primary ways that weeds spread. So the number one way, the most common way, is they're going to produce a bunch of seeds. The other way is they'll spread by stolons or rhizomes, like we talked about with the tilling or hoeing. And then also we can allow weeds to spread, and these weeds might not be that competitive or problematic, but because we're creating a perfect environment for them by the things that we do that's not naturally done, they're able to spread and take over. So here's some big seed producers and weeds that are growing from seed. So artillery weed, horseweed, this is wood sorrel, spurge, crabgrass, amaranth, pigweeds, and things like that can produce hundreds of thousands of seed, on one large mature plant. So these are going to be, the most common, but it's also going to be typically the easiest to control, because we can use things like mulch and stuff like that, and it's going to be pretty effective. Then we also have the weeds that can spread from vegetative means, so rhizomes and stolons and things like that, and tubers and bulblets and stuff. And so we have things like torpedo grass, nutsedge, dollarweed, etc. And those are going to be spreading mostly vegetatively. Some of these can also spread from seed, but vegetative spread is the primary concern. And then we also have some species that can spread by both. So like Bermuda grass, for example, it can come in from seed, or it can be spreading, from stolons or rhizomes. Kalinga is the same way. And then creeping oxalis, or wood sorrel, is the same way too, where it produces a lot of seeds, but can also grow vegetatively too. So we might have to use, a combination of tactics for some of these real troublesome species. And then a lot of the weed species, they're able to thrive because we're creating an unnatural environment. So like, for example, if you have a garden, or portion of your landscape, and you're irrigating too much, you might have a lot of dollarweed or torpedo grass that come in and become problematic. Something like some basket grass and stuff, it's going to come in those shaded areas, and people will say it's killing their turf grass, but it's not. It's growing where it's supposed to, in the shade. The turf grass shouldn't be in that densely shaded area. So right plant, right place, all those things are important. And if we choose the right plants and put those in the right place, then those plants are going to be a lot more competitive with these weed species, because whatever kind of environment that we create, there's going to be a weed that's going to be able to exploit that. So which method works best? So the annual weed spreading from seed, sanitation, exclusion, prevention, that's going to be true for any of the species. So we could also use mulch, flame weeding, solarization. Those naturally derived herbicides will be great on the annual weeds, especially when they're very small. We'd be able to use a lot less herbicide and probably get really good control with one application. And then also the weeds that are spreading from seed, they're typically not going to have a lot of underground reproductive structures like those stolons and rhizomes, etc. So we could go in and till those and use mechanical tillage and control all those. These annuals are going to be the most common, but we have the most options to control these. Just about all those different methods that I've talked about will work on these annual species. For those perennials, they're going to be a little bit more difficult. We can still focus on sanitation and things like that. Mulch is going to be good for some of them, but a lot of these perennials, they will be able to push up through even very deep layers of mulch. Solarization can be good for some of them, because a lot of them, they'll only have those underground reproductive structures, in the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. So solarization will be good for those. Naturally derived herbicides, we can use those. they're not going to be as effective, but repeated applications, we can typically get control. And then just manually removing those the best that we can would be good as well. Here's an example of Smilex growing up through some shrubbery, but big, thick tuber there. So if you just keep cutting off that stem, eventually that plant would die, but it would take a long time. And so just going in and actually removing that entire thing and working to remove those tubers would be the best way to control that permanently. So like I talked about, whatever kind of environment that we create, whether we're growing landscape ornamentals or garden plants or et cetera, there's going to be a weed that's going to be able to thrive in that environment. So we do have to focus on that prevention part of it, because it's always that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. So here's just some different ideas for some things that you could use for weed control. So here's some, this is a biodegradable weed control mat that's made out of, it's basically a paper material, but it could just be tilled into the soil, and it only lasts a few months, but will be good for a seasonal crop. And then, you know, it can, it'll break down, you know, over time. Not going to be as durable, but something that will work pretty good, allows moisture in. Straw and different types of materials like that, even though, like I talked about, pine straw is not going to last as long as something like pine bark. But if you're growing, you know, annual vegetable crop, what does it matter if it doesn't last but 3 or 4 months? That's going to be plenty of time to get your tomatoes or peppers or whatever out of there. Another thing too is just with irrigation. So putting in some type of drip irrigation or sprinkler emitters, something like that, is going to be a lot better than overhead irrigation. You're just watering that small portion of the garden where you actually need the water. And especially like during the spring where it's warm temperatures, if you apply overhead irrigation, and you might be wasting a lot of water and watering a lot more area than you really need to. And what can happen is that weed pressure is going to increase because we have the warm temperatures, but oftentimes the weeds aren't going crazy yet because there's not enough rainfall. But doing something like drip irrigation can really improve the results. Then you could go over the top of this with some kind of landscape fabric or weed cloth. I think I have some examples of that here. And typically when I give talks on weed control and planting beds and stuff, I typically do not recommend people use these weed cloths or weed mats. Some people like them and have good results. I never have. The research that I've seen, it typically increases, not increases weed growth, but you only provide a benefit for a short period of time, and then it becomes kind of a headache over time. But in a vegetable garden type situation, you know, you could put small little mats out there with some holes cut in those for your actual plants, and then they could be rolled up, stored until the next year. So you can reuse these multiple times if you get a good landscape fabric. It's not permanent like a landscape planting bed where you have azaleas and hollies and things like that. So these could be very useful, you know, for gardening areas. Some are biodegradable, like I talked about, that can be reused multiple times. You could also, so you could leave the areas with the plants bare and just use these as walkways and stuff like that to keep the weeds down, you know, in between rows of plants and things. So you could use them a bunch of different ways, and they'll just help to keep the weeds down and provide a little bit of a physical barrier there. So raised beds and containers, people ask whether it's better to go into the ground or use raised bed or containers. This would just give you some control over the soil, and it would allow you to start a little bit cleaner in terms of weed pressure. Like if someone converted an area of their lawn or their landscape into a garden, you know, you're going to have a lot of seed pressure there probably. But if you used, you know, a potting soil that gives you a little bit more control over that, higher organic matter, et cetera. And then also most of the bag soils and stuff like that are going to be pretty weed free. And so they could offer an advantage to that. Using those could give you, you know, a little bit more of a cleaner starting place than going just directly into the ground. The disadvantage would be that it will be more expensive, and you probably couldn't, you know, grow as large of an area in some cases. So this is Bree Arthur here. If anybody, I think the name of her book, I think, is Foodscape Revolution. But this is I believe this is her house here. She's in a IPPS group with me, and so I've gotten to know her. She's the president of that particular society right now, but real interesting person. Great knowledge of plants and everything, but she landscapes her whole house with basically edible plants, and so it's just cool to see them designed where she's got wheat and things like that planted all around her home, and that's how she grows her garden. And she would hate the idea of a raised bed and stuff like that. I've heard her give talks and things, but she works the edibles and garden plants into her entire landscape, and no bare spaces. So that could be another way of doing it. Kind of over planting or filling up all these void spaces where weeds don't have a chance to grow. Um, in those bare spaces, maybe you don't want to grow any more tomatoes or peppers or anything like that, but you could have a banker plant system and have some baker plants for some beneficial predator insects or for pollinators and things like that. And you could have that around the borders of your garden. So, and a lot of these pollinator plants and wildflowers and things like that can be pretty competitive and outcompete a lot of weed species. So just in summary, in small gardens, I would say most weeds are going to be able to be managed effectively using these non-chemical approaches. I don't think, in a small little garden, I don't think there's really going to be much need for herbicides unless you did, have some sort of really bad invasive plant in there. Like if you had Kogan grass in there, for example, I don't think you're going to be doing too good on your vegetables or strawberry patch or anything like that. You would want to get that out of there before you start growing, and that's probably not the best place to have a garden. But for most situations, I don't think you really need a lot of herbicides that we would think about. You can manage them using these non-chemical approaches. It can be more challenging with those perennial species, but if you keep at it over time, you can get control of those. The key is to know those weeds, how it spreads, how it's going to be most vulnerable. And then nature hates a void. Weeds will fill those voids. And so if we plant maybe even slightly over planting or slightly overcrowding, using those things in those bare spaces, those can help to outcompete the weeds also. And then also just keep in mind right plant, right place, because weeds are going to be able to grow, wherever, whatever kind of environment we create, the weeds are going to be able to thrive there, or at least a weed species will be able to thrive there. That's something to keep in mind too. So with that, I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has. And then just to leave you with a picture of some weeds coming up through asphalt there, and they are very tenacious. So thank you for your time and attention, and appreciate it.
We do have a few questions. You're able to, if you have questions, you can put it in the chat and they will go to me and to Dr. Marble, I believe. But we do have a couple questions for you. Greg has a question. I think he put this in when you were talking about the mulches. How effective are rice hulls in nursery pots?
I love rice hulls. We've actually got a huge research project on rice hulls right now. So they are great. It's lightweight. It's a byproduct, of rice. If someone's in like Arkansas or Louisiana, you can get it pretty cheap. Florida growers will typically have to pay to get it shipped down, but it's a great tool, especially the disadvantages that it can blow out of pots pretty easily. And I wouldn't recommend it in a landscape situation just because it is so lightweight. In a nursery, it's going to be overhead irrigated probably at least once per day. And if it stays a little bit moist, it's not going to be as prone to blowing out of pots. It's not going to work great in a landscape. But in nursery pots, or like if someone was doing a container garden, that would be a great tool to use.
Okay. And Wendy has a question about using baking soda for crabgrass.
Yeah, so people will do that. The baking soda, all those things. So basically, so with the baking soda, all you're doing is you're burning the crabgrass back. It's going to burn the turf grass in some cases. Sometimes it doesn't burn the turf grass as bad because a lot of your turf grasses are perennials, and so it's going to be able to recover from that. Whereas the crabgrass, especially if it's small as an annual, there's not going to be, a huge, any kind of big problems with anyone doing that. I would just say that, with the, if you're having issues with the crabgrass, look for the reason that the crabgrass is an issue in the first place. So the turf is probably thinning out, or, you have some other sort of problem there. So check that out. And I'm going to recommend people use, if you want to go natural, use a natural herbicide as opposed to just baking soda and stuff. People have done it. It's not technically labeled, but I mean, a homeowner is going to be able to do it without any a company couldn't do that. You couldn't hire a company to come and apply that. That would be illegal. A homeowner could technically do that, but you don't really know the rate or anything like that. So there's a couple issues with it, and the crabgrass will probably come back. So because you're going to have seed there, just work on correcting the issue in terms of why the crabgrass was a problem in the first place.
Right plant, right place. That's Florida friendly, and weeds certainly live by that motto. Anne has a question. This is a very good question. I'm with her. What can you do for Kogan grass?
So yeah, that's a tough one for Kogan grass. So it's the most invasive grass probably. It is in Florida, and probably the most difficult to control. So the herbicide recommendations are typically Imazipure is the herbicide that's recommended the most for it. Imazipure and glyphosate, tame mix at different ratios, or one or the other. And it's just going to be one of those that's going to require multiple applications. So it's going to be a slow process. We have probably, probably the best Kogan grass researcher in the U.S. here at Florida, Stephen Enlow, who's done a ton of work on Kogan grass. So he's got a lot of great publications on the biology of it, how to control it and stuff. So I would look for the EDIS publications by Dr. Stephen Enlow on Kogan grass.
Right, you can Google Kogan grass, Stephen Enlow, UF, and you'll find it. Let's see, Cindy says thank you. Sarah wants to know if you have any thoughts on pre-emergence.
For gardens, or just in general, or?
That's all she asks, is I guess just in general.
So in general, I think they're a great tool for weed control. And typically, when someone does incorporate a timely pre-emergence herbicide application, you can reduce the total amount of herbicide that you use overall. So I have a trial in right now where we're showing that if you do your pre-emergence herbicides, you can reduce your follow-up post-emergence herbicides and still get the same level of weed control. But it's always selecting the best pre-emergence herbicide for the weed species that you have. The mistake I think that people will make is that they just go and get buy any old pre-emergence herbicide, thinking that it's going to stop all the weed species. But just like with post-emergence herbicides, those aren't going to control all weed species either. So you want to select the best active ingredient for the weeds that you're dealing with. And then time it for the weed that you're trying to control. So crabgrass, something like that, it's going to be early in the spring. By the time doveweed comes around in May or August, that crabgrass application isn't going to be around anymore. So you'd want something else, and the stuff that's effective for crabgrass isn't going to be effective for doveweed, etc. So it goes the gambit. So know what weed you're targeting, and then be able to select the best pre-emergence for that. And again, I'd say those EDIS publications are the best thing to go for, because we'll lay out with different species which are the best herbicides for those.
Susan wants to know, I've never heard this question before. Apparently it's overtaking her garden beds, how to get rid of Asiatic jasmine. Okay, so yeah, so Asiatic jasmine, that's actually a very tough plant to control, actually. It can definitely take over and stuff. So there's a couple different ways. So like one of the ways that I've talked about that I've seen work is people like mow it down and then smother it out with that clear plastic and heat it up. If it's in shade, the jasmine will keep growing. So that might not work.
with herbicides, you have to go for, if you're going to use herbicides, you have to go like on to some of the pretty more powerful herbicides, like something like those vine killers and brush killers, like with triclopyr as one of the active ingredients. That's typically going to be the most effective. Glyphosate can work, but there's people that, I mean, we used to do work with glyphosate over the top of jasmine when we were trying to help nursery growers during the Great Recession. And so it's not as effective. It'll stun it, but it's a big difference between causing aesthetic injury to a plant where it doesn't look as good and killing it. And so you typically have to go with something like triclopyr or something like that to actually kill the Asiatic jasmine.
Sissy, thanks you for the environmentally friendly presentation. Diane wants to know how she can identify certain weeds or grass. When I pull up weeds in my yard, I sometimes mistake crabgrass for St. Augustine. I would say to take it by your extension office.
Yeah,
Or
you
a
could.
real close picture and send it to Dr. Lester. His email is wlester@ufl.edu. They can help you out with that. You know what I do? I just mow it. It's green,
Yeah.
it's mowable, it all blends together in my yard. Oh, that's okay. And I really liked your saying on no weed has developed a resistance to hand pulling. Stealing that one. But Effie has a question here about the best way to dispose of the weeds that she has pulled to avoid spreading.
So, I mean, you could put them in well, I guess it depends upon the species. So some species, I mean, you can compost them and they'll actually, I mean, it'll degrade the seed and everything. Personally, I mean, I'll tell you, what I do is not going to be what's recommended, but I take all those weeds that I pull in everywhere and I'll just put them in a pile, you know, around the edge of the landscape bed or whatever. And I just let them sit back there. And I mean, I don't care. I don't, me personally, so when I'm doing my yard maintenance and everything, I don't put anything to the street. When I do trimmings and stuff, I cut them all up and I throw them everywhere. I leave the grass clippings on the ground, etc. I mean, you could take it if it was something bad and like really invasive, you could take it and throw it into the garbage or whatever, especially if it had seeds. Once you, I mean, you could have a little compost pile, or you keep them, or you could mulch them up or throw them away or whatever. It just kind of depends upon the species. I just know which
And
ones
if
are going
they're
to be a
going to
problem and
be,
which ones aren't. So,
right. We would recommend putting them, if they're not an invasive exotic,
yeah.
into the compost pile as long as they're not going to seed. What I do, because I only have, or I only pay attention to the small areas like you mentioned, I'll throw them on the driveway for a few days, let the sun bake them.
Yeah.
You know, try to get some of the kick out of them. Eileen wants to know your opinion of cardboard in shrub beds.
Yeah. So in shrub beds, maybe I don't. I mean, it's a permanent thing. So I mean, the cardboard. I mean, it'll provide a benefit, but with the problem I've seen in like using the cardboard and stuff is that you get a rainstorm and that mulch blows off, and then you're just seeing a bunch of cardboard sitting there. In a garden type situation where maybe aesthetics aren't that important, you know, you could use it and cut some holes in it and stuff. But it just, I mean, it kind of depends upon the person. I don't think it's going to hurt anything naturally. You could, you know, if it was dry, you know, you might be reducing a little bit of water to the plant, but you cut, you know, a larger section out of it. It's not going to be, you know, a permanent fix or anything like that. It's going to degrade over time, but I would like it better in a garden type situation where it's something that you can move as opposed to a permanent situation like a shrub bed or something. So
I've even seen it used as the walkways in a vegetable garden. Yeah.
Yeah.
Effie has a very, very good question here. Do fresh wood chips need to cure before they are used as mulch?
Not really. I mean, you can grow. It depends upon the wood species. I guess some wood species, like if it was like a municipal waste or something. Some wood species can cause a reduction in some growth, but if you're using them as mulch and not incorporating them into the soil, typically there's not too much of an issue. I mean, there's growers, nursery growers that will grow plants for thousands, hundreds of thousands of plants in what they're calling green bark, and so that's like fresh pine bark that's coming off trees, or even fresh wood that's coming off the trees without aging it, substantially. So if it's used as a mulch, it's not going to really have to cure. It could be. I don't know. I don't think you're going to cause on a scale of a landscape. I don't think you're going to cause much issue in terms of any nitrogen immobilization or anything like that. In most cases, if it's just on top of the soil, and I don't think with most plant species you're not going to have any kind of allelopathic effect. You could with some, but it would just depend upon the wood species. So that's kind of a tough question.
And you always want to keep the mulch several inches away from the actual plants. Right. So
yeah, you don't want to pile them up around the stems or anything like that anyways.
Wanda wants to know if you have any suggestions on what to use for thistles.
For
Stand
thistles.
far away. Yes.
So I'll tell you what I did, or what I had to do was, and this is why I became a weed scientist. When I was little and I would get into trouble, I'd have to go and hoe the garden and pull the thistles and the blackberries and all that. And I told my brother, I said, one day I'm going to kill all these weeds. And so I studied for 10 years and became a weed scientist. But so yeah, you could, you could with the thistles and stuff. So a lot of the methods that I talked about, it depends upon what species. Again, some of those are biennial and perennial. You can hand pull those, with some gloves, and they're not, too damaging or anything like that. Or you can, the flame weeders work. You can solarize those where those seeds aren't going to come back up, because those seeds are going to be wind-borne and typically on the top part of the soil. But all those methods that I talked about can work on thistles too. The key is just trying to get them before they get too large.
Okay. And Sarah has a question about any product suggestions for a lawn. I think that is too long of an answer at this moment. What I would do is contact whatever county that you're in, Sarah, your county extension office. Sorry about that. Because it depends on the type of lawn you have, for one thing. And you need to figure out, do you have a Bahia? Do you have Zoysia? Do you have St. Augustine, Floritam? And go from there. So I would contact your local county extension office and ask to speak to a master gardener or the horticulture agent. And they can, take the time to really walk you through that. Teresa has shared a Kogan grass publication link with us. Judith wants to know if you mentioned early on that the herbicide was taken off of the market clopyralid.
Yeah, so that used to be, it's not off the market, it's just used now in commercial landscapes. So clopyralid, however you want to pronounce it. The trade name for that is Lawn Trail, and it was a great broadleaf herbicide for St. Augustine grass lawns. The problem is that people were using it on their lawn, and then they were using their grass clippings in vegetable plants, or putting it around ornamental plants and stuff. And clopyralid can have, it can cause a lot of damage to those, especially vegetable plants and stuff. It's the same thing with aminopyralid, which is a very similar herbicide that's used in pastures. So that would be another thing. Like you can run into issues, like if someone was to go and get a bunch of fresh manure from a ranch somewhere or something, and then just go and apply it without knowing anything about that situation, you can get some of those pasture herbicides and stuff like that in the manure, which can cause issues in some cases. So we've seen that before with compost and things. So with the clopyralid, what they did was they just wouldn't allow it. Now it's not labeled for use in residential lawns. It can still be used in commercial lawns, so like at office buildings and stuff like that. But it was a good, really good herbicide, and controlled a lot of weeds where we didn't have a lot of good options. But because of those concerns and things and the issues that they were having, because it does stay around in plant material for a while. They took it off the residential side.
Okay. Mark wants to know how he can get a copy of your slides. Can you send a PDF of them to Dr. Lester?
I can, yeah. I'll
Okay.
send him a copy of them, and then he can give them to whoever wants them.
Right. So if you want a PDF copy of Dr. Marble's slides for today's presentation, then email Bill Lester at, again, W Lester, Lester, at ufl.edu. Okay, I think we've got finally to the end of our questions. Thank you very, very much. That was very interesting today. You held on to a lot of people all this time. So obviously a lot of people have an interest in this. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Marble. And I'm sure Dr. Lester will ask you to come speak to us again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for having me. I enjoy it.